behind every velvet curtain of Nashville's most hallowed stages, there's a cloud of smoke that refuses to vanish. Country music, for all its soulful twang and down-home charm, has long danced hand-in-hand with a habit as old as the honky-tonks themselves. From outlaw icons to sweet-voiced songbirds, the image of the country star lighting up backstage, cigarette dangling between fingers calloused from guitar strings, others lit up in the spotlight, becoming larger-than-life symbols of rugged freedom. But all of them left behind a legacy wrapped in tobacco haze. And what you're about to see may just change the way you hear their music forever. 1. Johnny Cash, the Man in Black and the Marlboros. When you think of Johnny Cash, you think of defiance, a baritone voice soaked in gravel, a silhouette draped in black, a rebel who walked the line between sinner and saint. But behind that legendary mystique was a constant presence, a lit cigarette, almost always smoldering in his hand or between his lips. Cash wasn't just a smoker. He was a lifelong chain smoker, starting in his teens and puffing through decades of touring, recording, and struggling with addiction. Often paired with alcohol and pills, cigarettes were a key part of his self-destructive routine during the 1960s, when he was spiraling out of control. It wasn't uncommon for him to smoke several packs a day, sometimes lighting one cigarette with the last ember of another. Even after he got clean from drugs in the early 70s, the cigarettes remained a stubborn companion. Those who knew him said his dressing rooms were thick with smoke, and he'd light up before shows, after interviews, even during hospital stays. It wasn't until the late 1990s, after decades of chronic bronchitis and worsening respiratory issues, that he reportedly tried to quit for good. But the damage was already done. Johnny Cash's later years were marked by a haunting shortness of breath. His voice, once booming, became cracked and whispery, a reflection of years spent inhaling fire. He died in 2003 at the age of 71, just 4 months after losing his wife, June. While heart disease was the official cause, many close to him believed the smoking had irreparably weakened his body. To fans, he remains an untouchable legend. But behind the image of the Man in Black was a man slowly burning from the inside out. 2. George Jones, smoke, heartache, and the voice of a broken soul. They called him the Possum. But behind that nickname was a man who lived every heartbroken lyric he sang and smoked through every verse of it. George Jones wasn't just one of country's greatest vocalists. He was also one of its most troubled souls, and a relentless chain smoker who made no apologies for his vices. Jones started smoking early, and like his drinking, it wasn't casual, it was compulsive. His friends and fellow musicians recall him lighting cigarette after cigarette, often chain smoking while seated at the piano or slouched in a studio booth. Even during his infamous benders, where he'd disappear for days, sometimes weeks, his smokes were always within reach. By the late 1980s, when he finally sobered up from alcohol, cigarettes remained the final crutch. Some insiders said it was the only addiction he never truly shook. And it showed. Years of constant smoking shredded his once crystalline voice. That silky tone that brought pain to life in songs like He Stopped Loving Her Today turned grittier, shakier, raspier. Still, Jones kept performing well into his 70s, often struggling for breath but refusing to leave the stage or put down the cigarette. In interviews, he joked about it. "I've quit everything else," he once said, "but damn it, I can't quit these." But there was no punchline to the toll it took. George Jones died in 2013 from hypoxic respiratory failure, a condition worsened by years of heavy smoking. He was 81. Country music may never have another voice like his, but it also may never again see someone so devoted to his vices, even as they slowly stole his voice. 3. Tammy Wynette, the First Lady of Country and Unfiltered Cigarettes. She was the queen of heartbreak ballads, the voice behind Stand By Your Man, and a symbol of feminine strength wrapped in vulnerability. But behind the perfectly styled blonde hair and rhinestone gowns, Tammy Wynette battled demons that were often soothed, if only temporarily, by the flick of a lighter. Tammy was a longtime smoker, often photographed or seen backstage with a cigarette in hand. It was a habit she picked up early in her career, a coping mechanism amid the whirlwind of fame, multiple marriages, chronic health issues, and a relentless touring schedule. Her brand? Unfiltered Pall Malls, and she reportedly smoked them for decades, even during her hospital stays. And there were many hospital stays. Beginning in the late 1970s, Tammy's health began to collapse. She suffered from painful intestinal and abdominal issues, underwent dozens of surgeries, and relied heavily on pain medications. But through it all, the cigarettes stayed. What's most haunting is that the very voice that made her a legend, soft, aching, unmistakably feminine, was gradually eroded by years of smoking. Her breathing became labored in her later years, and by the 1990s, she was frequently performing while seated due to fatigue and chronic pain. Still, she never gave up the mic or the smoke. Tammy Wynette died in 1998 at just 55 years old. The official cause was a blood clot, but medical experts and biographers have long pointed to her lifetime of smoking and medical complications as key contributors to her early death. To fans, she was the tragic heroine of country music, but behind that voice was a woman caught in a storm of pain and a cloud of cigarette smoke she never escaped. 4. Merle Haggard, Cigarettes, Outlaws, and a Voice, Aged in Smoke. Few country stars have lived as hard or as authentically as Merle Haggard. Born into poverty, raised in trouble, and forged in prison, Haggard became one of the defining voices of the outlaw country movement. But for all his grit and poetry, one thing stayed with him longer than his jail time or his lovers: his addiction to cigarettes. Merle started smoking as a teenager, and by the time his fame exploded in the 1960s with hits like Mama Tried and Okie from Muskogee, he was already a full-blown chain smoker. He reportedly smoked up to 3 packs a day during the height of his career, often lighting up in the studio, on stage, and in interviews. It became a signature habit, one he didn't care to hide. But the effects were devastating. Haggard's once clean baritone grew rough and ragged with time. While that gravelly tone added a certain character to his later recordings, it also came at a cost. In 2008, he was diagnosed with lung cancer and underwent surgery to remove part of his lung. The diagnosis shocked fans, but not those close to him. They knew the years of smoke had finally caught up. Though he quit smoking after surgery, the damage had already been done. Haggard continued to perform, stubborn as ever, but was increasingly frail. His final years were marked by ongoing health issues, including recurring pneumonia, likely tied to his history of smoking. Merle Haggard passed away in 2016 on his 79th birthday, a poetic ending to a hard-lived life. His death certificate listed pneumonia, but the truth is he had been breathing through smoke for too many decades to recover. He left behind a catalog of honest, aching music and a cautionary tale about the high cost of outlaw living. 5. Waylon Jennings, the outlaw king who lit more than just stages. If Merle Haggard was the outlaw philosopher, then Waylon Jennings was the outlaw enforcer. Fierce, electric, and unapologetically rough around the edges, Jennings redefined what it meant to be a country rebel. But one rebellion he could never win: his battle with nicotine addiction. Waylon smoked hard and often. Friends say he'd go through up to 6 packs a day. Yes, 6. Whether backstage before a concert, lounging in the tour bus, or between takes in the studio, there was almost always a cigarette between his fingers. The man practically exhaled more smoke than his guitar amp. Like his drug use, Waylon's smoking wasn't just a bad habit, it was part of his outlaw persona. He smoked on stage, on album covers, and even during interviews. And for decades, he didn't seem to care about the warnings or the consequences. But the consequences came anyway. In the late 1980s and early 90s, Jennings was diagnosed with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, and type 2 diabetes. His lungs, ravaged by years of smoke and stress, began to give out. Even after he finally gave up drugs, the cigarettes remained longer than most would admit. By the end, he was using a wheelchair, struggling to breathe, and forced to cancel shows due to his failing health. In 2002, Waylon Jennings passed away at age 64 from complications related to diabetes, but those close to him knew his respiratory decline was worsened by decades of cigarette smoke. He helped build the outlaw movement, lit by grit, fueled by fire, and fogged by smoke. Waylon never asked for forgiveness, and he never pretended to be something he wasn't. But if you listen closely to his later recordings, you can almost hear the sound of lungs worn thin by fire. 6. Patsy Cline, a voice of velvet, silhouetted in smoke. She was elegance wrapped in sorrow, with a voice that could both shatter hearts and soothe them. Patsy Cline remains one of the most iconic female voices in country music history. But few fans realize that behind the scenes, she was also a heavy smoker, using cigarettes to chase away anxiety and the crushing pressure of fame. Cline rose to fame in the late 1950s, during an era when smoking was fashionable, even encouraged, especially for entertainers. She started smoking in her teens and, by her 20s, was a regular smoker both on and off stage. Friends and bandmates often recalled the haze of cigarette smoke that followed her backstage, in dressing rooms, and even on long tours where nerves ran high. Unlike many of her male counterparts, Patsy never romanticized smoking. It wasn't part of an outlaw image. For her, it was a coping mechanism. She battled stage fright, industry sexism, and the exhausting pressure of being one of the first women to break into country's male-dominated mainstream. Cigarettes became a constant companion, a brief escape from a world that demanded perfection. Tragically, Cline's career was cut short before smoking could take its full toll. She died in a plane crash in 1963 at just 30 years old, a shocking end to a voice that had only begun to change country music forever. But those close to her believed that had she lived longer, her addiction to cigarettes may have become a more visible burden on her health and vocals. Today, her memory is crystal clear in recordings like Crazy and I Fall to Pieces. But what remains hidden in the background of those legendary sessions is a quiet exhale of smoke, a ghost of the pain she never let the music fully reveal. 7. Hank Williams Sr., a burning star that faded too fast. Few names carry the mythic weight of Hank Williams Sr. The original tortured troubadour of country music, his songs defined heartache for generations. But behind the sorrow in his voice and the poetry in his lyrics was a man trapped in a whirlwind of pain, alcohol, and yes, cigarettes. Williams was a smoker from a young age, likely picking up the habit during his teenage years while performing in dive bars and roadhouses across the Deep South. As his fame skyrocketed in the late 1940s, so did his consumption of nicotine and alcohol. Stories from the road often mention his constant puffing, whether in tour buses, hotel rooms, or while waiting to perform backstage. Unlike others who hid their habit, Hank smoked with a kind of desperation. It wasn't about image, it was about survival. Struggling with severe back pain due to spina bifida occulta and self-medicating with pills and liquor, the cigarettes became one more tool in his arsenal of short-term relief. Those around him worried. His voice, though brilliant, began to fray. His breath control on stage grew uneven. He often coughed between songs, yet he never stopped smoking, even when doctors warned him to. By 29, Hank Williams was dead. On New Year's Day, 1953, he was found lifeless in the backseat of a Cadillac, somewhere in the icy dark between gigs. The official cause? Heart failure. But the deeper truth is layered. A body worn thin by substances, exhaustion, and a chest lined with tar. In the end, Hank burned fast and bright, a supernova of talent and tragedy, his songs echoing far beyond the smoke that once surrounded him. 8. Loretta Lynn, coal miner's daughter, and the quiet fire of tobacco. She was strong, proud, and unfiltered in both her lyrics and, for many years, her personal habits. Loretta Lynn, the trailblazing coal miner's daughter, didn't just revolutionize country music for women. She also quietly fought private battles, including a long relationship with cigarettes that few fans ever truly saw. Growing up in the hills of Butcher Hollow, Kentucky, where tobacco was a way of life, smoking wasn't unusual. Loretta started young, during a time when smoking was practically stitched into rural American culture, especially in coal country. By the time she began recording in the 1960s, she was already a regular smoker, and it became a part of her daily life. Though unlike some of her peers, she rarely did it in public or as part of her image. Behind the scenes, however, tourmates and road crew recalled a dressing room thick with smoke. She often lit up between takes in the studio and during stressful travel days, using cigarettes as both comfort and composure. Loretta was known for her powerful voice and stamina on stage, but years of smoking began to wear on her lungs, especially during her later years. In interviews, she didn't speak much about it, but she hinted at regrets. Her daughter, Patsy Lynn, later confirmed that her mother eventually quit smoking, but not before it had taken a toll on her health. In her final years, Loretta dealt with multiple health challenges, including pneumonia and breathing issues, some of which were believed to be worsened by her earlier smoking habit. Loretta passed away in 2022 at the age of 90, a towering figure in music history. While her voice will always symbolize strength, it's worth remembering the smoke she endured in silence, behind the glamour, behind the microphone, far from the spotlight. Willie Nelson, a life lived in smoke, but not just tobacco. You can't talk about country music, and certainly not smoking, without talking about Willie Nelson. The red-headed stranger, the cosmic cowboy, the man whose very silhouette, with his long braids and ever-present plume of smoke, became as iconic as the American flag. But here's the twist. While Willie is most famously associated with marijuana, he spent decades as a traditional cigarette smoker too. And it nearly cost him everything. In his early years, back when he was still trying to make a name in Nashville, Willie was a pack-a-day man. Cigarettes were part of his routine, before shows, in hotel rooms, and behind the wheel of tour buses. Combined with his famously grueling tour schedule, often over 200 dates a year, the habit began to wear down even his seemingly unbreakable constitution. By the 1980s, years of tobacco and marijuana smoke had taken a visible toll on his lungs. Willie began experiencing serious breathing problems, even collapsing during a performance in the early 90s. The wake-up call came when doctors diagnosed him with emphysema and warned that if he didn't quit cigarettes, he'd lose his ability to sing. Or worse, lose his life. So he quit, cold turkey. Nelson made the dramatic decision to give up tobacco completely and switch to vaping marijuana or using edibles, a move that shocked fans but likely saved his career. He also started biking, swimming, and practicing martial arts, part of his image reinvention in his later years. Now in his 90s, Willie Nelson remains a living legend, a man who sang through the haze, stared down his mortality, and somehow kept going. But even he admits, I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't stopped cigarettes when I did. 10. Conway Twitty, the smoky seducer. With a voice of velvet, with a single smirk and a silky voice, Conway Twitty could make stadiums swoon. Known for hits like Hello Darlin' and I'd Love to Lay You Down, he was country music's quintessential crooner, oozing charm, passion, and old-school masculinity. But behind that smooth persona was a quiet but powerful addiction to cigarettes. Twitty was a lifelong smoker, often spotted with a cigarette tucked between his fingers just off stage or in between takes during studio sessions. While his image was never as outlaw as some of his peers, his habit was just as serious. Crew members and bandmates remember the cloud of smoke that followed him backstage and how he often lit up before walking into interviews or sound checks. As his fame grew in the 1970s and 80s, so did the pressure, and Conway leaned harder into his smoking routine. He once admitted in private conversations that cigarettes helped him relax before performances. But like so many others, the relief was temporary. His health, particularly his lungs and vocal stamina, began to suffer in the 1990s. Friends say he had a persistent cough and sometimes struggled with breath control on longer ballads. Though he tried to reduce his smoking in later years, he never fully quit. And in 1993, after collapsing on tour, Twitty died from an abdominal aneurysm at the age of 59. While not directly related to smoking, many have speculated that his lifelong tobacco use likely exacerbated his overall health issues, including high blood pressure and circulation problems. To fans, Conway Twitty will always be the romantic hero of country music. But behind the love songs and tender words was a voice weathered by smoke, softened by years of inhaling what would slowly undo him. 11. Kris Kristofferson, a scholar, a rebel, and a smoker in the shadows. Few country stars are as multifaceted or as enigmatic as Kris Kristofferson, a Rhodes Scholar, a helicopter pilot, a Golden Globe-winning actor, a poetic songwriter whose lyrics bled with honesty. But beneath all those accomplishments was a man who, for much of his career, found solace and silence in cigarette smoke. Kristofferson wasn't flashy about it. He wasn't lighting up on stage like Waylon Jennings or caught chain smoking in every interview like George Jones. But those who worked closely with him knew. Kris smoked for decades, often in private, often alone. On long writing nights and restless tour stops, cigarettes were a constant fixture. He smoked through the writing of Me and Bobby McGee, Sunday Morning Coming Down, and Help Me Make It Through the Night. Songs soaked in solitude, regret, and reflection. And in some ways, the cigarettes mirrored the man, contemplative, weathered, quietly burning. In his later years, Kristofferson's health began to decline, with a series of misdiagnoses that confused Lyme disease symptoms with early dementia. His raspy voice, once clear and commanding, took on a ghostly, hushed tone. Though he eventually quit smoking, the long-term effects on his lungs and vocal cords were evident, especially during his final tours in the 2010s. Kristofferson retired from performing in 2020, his legacy secured, but also marked by the quiet wear of choices made in smoke-filled hotel rooms and behind closed dressing room doors. To this day, fans remember the wisdom in his lyrics, but few realize how much of it was written through the haze of tobacco, drifting over a notepad filled with heartbreak and brilliance. 12. Randy Travis, Smoke Behind the Baritone. With his smooth baritone and boyish charm, Randy Travis brought a neo-traditionalist revival to country music in the 1980s. Hits like Forever and Ever, Amen, and Deeper Than the Holler made him one of the most beloved voices of his generation. But behind that clean-cut image was a quieter reality. Travis was a longtime smoker, and the habit would come back to haunt him in ways no one predicted. Unlike the rowdy outlaw crowd, Randy's smoking wasn't part of his brand. In fact, he was often promoted as a wholesome alternative to the hard-living country stars of decades past. But those close to him, bandmates, crew, and friends, knew that offstage, cigarettes were a daily ritual. He smoked between takes in the studio, before shows, and while decompressing after long tours. What made it worse was that Travis had an unusually delicate respiratory system for a singer. Even minor colds would affect his vocal cords severely. By the late 2000s, fans and critics noticed a gradual weakening in his vocal delivery, his once sturdy baritone growing thinner and raspier. Then came the real blow. In 2013, Travis suffered a massive stroke following complications from viral cardiomyopathy. Though not caused directly by smoking, many in the medical field pointed out that his smoking history, combined with other health risks, likely contributed to his vulnerability. He spent years recovering, regaining speech slowly, and has only recently made limited public appearances. Randy's career was a gift to country music, but it was also a reminder that even the cleanest image can hide quiet habits, and that sometimes the damage doesn't show until it's too late. 13. Tanya Tucker. Fire, grit, and a trail of smoke. Few women in country music have lived as loudly or as fearlessly as Tanya Tucker. Bursting onto the scene as a teenager with the hit Delta Dawn, she quickly became a force of nature in a male-dominated industry. But with that force came fire, and for Tanya, that fire was often accompanied by a cigarette. Tanya was just 13 when she became a star. Thrown into a whirlwind of fame, adult pressures, and endless touring, she quickly developed habits well beyond her years, including smoking. By her late teens, Tanya was a regular smoker, lighting up before shows, after parties, and everywhere in between. Unlike others who kept their habits backstage, Tanya didn't hide it. She was the rebel girl of country, riding motorcycles, dating rock stars, and puffing away without apology. Cigarettes, for her, were part of a persona, tough, wild, and untamed. But as the years wore on, so did the toll on her voice. Her early vocals were rich, powerful, and unmistakably Southern. Yet by the 1990s, critics noted a rougher edge creeping into her recordings. Some praised it as lived-in and authentic. Others suspected years of smoking and hard living were catching up. Tanya herself admitted in interviews that her voice had changed, though she embraced the grit as part of her journey. In more recent years, Tanya has taken steps to reclaim her health. She's reduced her smoking, focused on fitness, and even staged a triumphant comeback with her Grammy-winning 2019 album, While I'm Livin'. But the shadows of her smoking days remain, in the husk of her tone and in the resilience it took to keep singing through the haze. Tanya Tucker didn't just survive the smoky backrooms of country music, she owned them. 14. Alan Jackson, Traditional Roots and a Hidden Habit. With his tall frame, Stetson hat, and gentlemanly stage presence, Alan Jackson became the face of traditional country revival in the 1990s. Songs like Chattahoochee and Remember When gave him a place among the genre's most respected artists. But while his public image was clean and polished, few fans knew that Alan Jackson was also a longtime smoker, a detail rarely discussed but quietly present throughout his rise. Jackson wasn't known for rowdy behavior or public scandals. In fact, he cultivated a calm, family man reputation that helped him stand apart from the wild energy of Nashville's hard-living crowd. But behind the scenes, those who worked closely with him spoke of his quiet, regular smoking habit, often kept out of view from the press and fans. It was a kind of Southern ritual, smoking between takes, during songwriting sessions, or while winding down after shows. While never a heavy chain smoker like George Jones or Waylon Jennings, Alan's steady cigarette use was part of his private routine for years. As he entered his late 50s, changes in his voice began to draw attention. He sounded rougher in interviews, sometimes hoarse during live performances. Though he never publicly blamed smoking, industry insiders noted that the wear on his vocals was consistent with long-term tobacco use. In 2021, Jackson revealed he had been diagnosed with Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, a progressive neurological condition affecting his balance and muscles. While unrelated to smoking, the news put a spotlight on his health and prompted renewed speculation about how his past habits may have compounded his physical challenges. Alan Jackson remains a towering figure in country music. But as his voice grows quieter, it's worth remembering the subtle smoke behind the sound and how even the most seemingly wholesome stars aren't untouched by Nashville's old ghosts. 15. Buck Owens, the Bakersfield sound and the smoke that came with it. Before there was outlaw country, before the Nashville sound was even questioned, there was Buck Owens, the twangy pioneer of the Bakersfield sound. With his red, white, and blue guitar and a voice as sharp as barbed wire, Owens changed the course of country music. But like many of his contemporaries, he carried with him a constant cloud of cigarette smoke, a lesser-known but ever-present part of his persona. Buck Owens wasn't flashy about his smoking, but it was no secret either. Band members from his long-running group, the Buckaroos, recall his ever-present pack of cigarettes, often resting on an amplifier or tucked into his front shirt pocket. Long days on tour, endless rehearsals, and the stress of running his business empire, radio stations, real estate, and even a record label, kept the pressure high. Cigarettes were his constant companion. He smoked in the studio. He smoked on set during his years co-hosting Hee Haw. And while his image was cleaner than many of his rowdier peers, he wasn't immune to the damage. By the 1980s, Buck's voice began to change. That sharp Bakersfield twang softened. Less punch, more strain. Though he never publicly blamed smoking, many fans noticed that his later recordings lacked the vocal stamina of his heyday. He eventually began limiting performances and scaled back touring, citing exhaustion and health concerns. Owens passed away in 2006 at the age of 76 from heart failure. While not directly attributed to smoking, those close to him believed that his long history with tobacco had quietly eroded his health over the years. It didn't steal his legacy, but it did steal a bit of the fire behind that famous Telecaster twang. Buck Owens gave country music a new sound and a new attitude. But behind the innovation and television charm was a man smoking through the pressure, burning through decades of country history.